Okay, so in today's lesson, we are going to talk about Adobe Photoshop. So yeah, Adobe Photoshop is basically a software that we use in editing or creating images. But in our modern or current world, people don't just use Photoshop for only editing or creating photos. They also use it for stuff like posters and other graphic design products. So today we are going to delve into the interface of Photoshop. We are going to open our Photoshop software. Okay, first, when you first open Photoshop, this is the interface you are going to see. This is the main interface you see. And when you open any other Adobe software, you're going to see a similar interface. Let me see if I can open Illustrator so you see what I'm talking about. Yeah, I think I forgot to mention this earlier. Anytime you open an Adobe product or an Adobe software, you see this rectangular artwork. This is what we call a splash screen. So a splash screen is basically like a loading screen. So that's what you see before the actual software window opens up. Okay, so in Illustrator, you're going to see a similar interface when you first open the software, just like in Photoshop. So this is basically what you see when you open any Adobe product or any Adobe software. But we are not looking at Illustrator today. We are only focusing on Photoshop. So once you've installed the software, once you have the software on your PC or your laptop, what's the next step? How do you start creating? How do you start designing whatever it is you want to design? So on the left side of my Photoshop window, you see this option here that says create a new file, and then you see open. So new file basically means that you want to create use this option if you want to create a whole new Photoshop document or a whole new file to work with. But you use the second one, which is open, to open a file that you've already started working on. So let's say you have a design that you started and you saved, and then you want to go back to that design. You use the open option right here. But since we don't have any products already, or any file already saved, you are going to go with the new file. So once the software opens and you want to create a new file, you go to this option, new file. And there's a different method to creating a new file. So let's say you don't want to go with this one. You can go to the top here, the menu bar. You see file. So you click file and then you see this option that says new. And there's a shortcut to which is Ctrl+N. So you can either use the Ctrl+N to create a new Photoshop document, or you can go to file, click new to create a new document, or you can use this button right here to create a new document or a new Photoshop file. So you're going to create a new file in Photoshop. So I'll click this button. Once I click the new file option, we're going to have a second window. So this window is basically a window that helps you choose the resolution or a width and height that you want to work with. So let's say you are designing a flyer or a poster for a certain event or for a certain brand, and then the person has given you the width and the height to work with. Let's say the person is going to print out the design, and then you have been given a width, you've been given a height. So this window allows you to set that height, that width, and also the resolution of that design you are going to create. So on my left side here, you see preset details. So right underneath, you see Untitled 1. So Untitled 1 is the default name given to every new Photoshop file you create. But we don't want to name this file Untitled 1, so we are going to change it to something else. So we are going to name it My First Design. So whatever you enter here, whatever you type in this space is basically the name you are giving to your Photoshop file. So let's say you have an event design you're creating, and let's say the event title is Amer's birthday party. You can name it there, Amer's birthday party. So what this helps you with is, in case you've saved your file and then you're trying to find that same file next time, and let's say you have a bunch of ton of other documents inside your folder, the naming of that file helps you identify that exact file you're looking for. So you don't have to go through multiple different files. And also that's why it's always recommended to name your files with something that you would remember next time you want to maybe edit or go back to that work. Okay, so we have our file name here, or our preset name here. And then we have the width. By default, the unit here is pixels. But if you click on this drop down, you see other units. We have inches, centimeters, millimeters, points, and picas. I think in one of the lessons I explained what pixels are. So pixels are basically little square boxes that contain just one color, and multiple or millions of these little boxes or little squares come together to form an image. So that's what pixels are. Pixels are basically small squares that come together to form an image. So since we are going to be designing for a social media post, we are going to use this unit here, the default unit, which is pixels. But before we continue with the rest, I'm going to open Gemini so that we create a design brief. So we can use that design brief to go through the tutorial. I think I explained what a design brief is in the recent lesson I uploaded on YouTube. Okay, so I have my Gemini opened, and then I'm going to type a prompt. So generate a sample design brief for a social media event post. Okay, so it has given us a sample brief here. So the title of our brief is social media event post, and then we have the project overview. So the name of the project it has given us is Creative Confluence 2026. So since it has given us a new project name, we can replace the file name we gave to our project. So we'll replace it with this one. So I'll copy this one, Creative Confluence 2026, go back to Photoshop, and then I'm going to edit this here, which is the name of our project. So I'll change this to our new project title, which is Creative Confluence 2026. Then let's go back to our prompt. And it says the name of our client is the Digital Creator Network, and the project type is a social media promotional graphic. The event date is May 23rd, 2026, time 6 p.m. So the project objective is to create an engaging, high-impact social media graphic designed to drive event registrations and build anticipation. The post must capture the attention of digital creatives while clearly communicating the value of attending the event. So their target audience is graphic designers, animators, podcasters, and digital illustrators. Okay, so it has given us the deliverables or technical specifications. So it says deliverable 1, which is the main post. Our dimension should be 1080 or 1080 by 1080 pixels, since it's for social media. So we are going to input these dimensions into our Photoshop software. So we'll go back to Photoshop, and then here we can see the width. And since it's 1080 by 1080 or 1080 by 1080, it basically means that the width and the height are going to be the same. So 1080 by 1080 basically means that you're going to get a square. You're going to get a square canvas for our project. So let's input that value here. So width 1080 and then our height 1080. Okay, so we've input our values here, our width 1080 and our height 1080. With the orientation option, what this does is, let's say our project is supposed to be a 1080 by, let's say 1200. Let me input that. So let's say these are the dimensions we're supposed to use. And then instead of having the 1200 in the height, we wanted it to be at the top and then our width to be at the bottom. And since maybe you don't want to retype the entire thing, what you can do is to just change the orientation here. So this swaps the values. It swaps the values in between the width and the height. So that's basically what the orientation does. If you click portrait, it makes your dimensions a portrait dimension. If you choose landscape, it makes it a landscape dimension. So let's go back to our actual values, which is 1080 by 1080. And since this is a square dimension, if you click these two, nothing happens because it's a square. And then we have artboards. So what we use artboards for is, let's say you want to create not just one design in your Photoshop file. You want, let's say, 2 to 3 designs in one Photoshop file. Or let's say you want to create a carousel document. You'd enable the artboards option. So this allows you to create multiple artboards in one Photoshop document or in one Photoshop file. Okay. So we are not going to use that. Since we are creating just one design or one canvas or one artboard, we'll leave this disabled. And then we'll go on to our resolution. So there are different resolutions for different tasks you want to take. So since this is a social media post, we can go online and search for the best resolution for social media post. So best resolution for social media. Okay, so it's basically giving us the dimensions of a post, but that's not what we are looking for. So let's add DPI to it. The best DPI for website images or on-screen images are 72 ppi. So we are going to use 72 ppi for our resolution. So we'll go back to Photoshop and then we'll change this option here to pixels per inch, and then we'll make this 72. So always make sure that this option is set to pixels/inch or pixels per inch. And if you are working on a design that you are not going to print and it's basically going to be for just social media platforms, you can just leave it at the default. The default is mostly 300, but you can also change it to 72. So that you don't overload your documents or make the document size too huge. Next one we have is the color mode. So there are 2 or 3 basic color modes in design. In the previous lesson, I talked about one of the lessons I talked about the RGB and then the CMYK, where I said that the CMYK is a color mode or color space for printed documents or for printed design, and then RGB is a color mode for on-screen designs or on-screen images. And since we are not going to print this one, we are going to leave it at RGB color, and then we'll leave the bits at the default. So I think the rest of the options here, you can leave them at the default. You don't have to change any of that. We've entered our dimensions and then our resolution and our project name. Let's say we want to create another design in the future, but we're going to use the same dimensions and the same resolution, or we don't want to come back and input the same values again. What we can do is to click on this icon here. So this icon allows you to save the preset, so that next time you're going to create a design with a similar dimension or a similar resolution, you can just click on that preset and then start with your design instead of coming to input every single value all over again. So click on this option here, and it says Save Document Preset. So you're going to name this preset. So name this 1 by 1. So 1 by 1 basically means square. So 1 by 1 social media post. And then I'll save this preset. So when you save your preset, it comes to this. In this menu, you can see saved photo print. It comes to the saved option here. So when you tap saved, you see every other preset you've saved. And then when you go to recent, you see the recent dimensions or the recent document sizes you've saved or worked with. So since we've created a new preset here, you can see here 1 by 1 social media post. So in case you're going to work on a new project with a similar resolution, you can come back to this and then just create it from there. And there are other options here you can choose from, but we'll talk about those in the subsequent lessons. So since we've put in all our dimensions here, we can just go ahead and click create. So this is where the problem is, or this is what most people have a problem with. When they open the software, they see all these options and all these tools and all these menus, and then sometimes it can be overwhelming. But we're going to go through each and everything step by step so you don't get confused or you don't get lost in it. Okay, so this over here is what we call the interface or the Photoshop interface. But before I continue, let me just set this to the default workspace so that you understand whatever I'm doing. So I'm going to reset this workspace. Okay, so when you open the software for the first time, this is what you see. This interface is what we call the Photoshop interface. So this is basically like your steering wheel. This is your steering wheel to doing anything at all in the software. So here you can see some boxes here. So these boxes are what we call panels. When you open any kind of software, whether a design software or a video editing software, you see these windows here. These windows here or these boxes here are what we call panels. So each panel or a panel in a software is basically a house, or let's see, a box where they input certain values or certain adjustment that you can make to apply to a certain layer, or let's see, your whole design in general. Each and every single thing here you see is a panel, and there are different types of panel in the software. We have this panel. So this panel is for our canvas, or you click and drag it out of our interface, you can see here. So this panel is what contains our canvas or our artboards. So this white space is basically where we are going to do all our designs, or where we are going to put in all our design elements. And on the left, you can see this long panel here. So this panel is what we call the tools panel. So the tools panel is basically the tools and equipment. It basically houses the tools and equipment you use in your design. Let's say you want to add a certain shape, you want to add a certain color, you want to make some changes or move something on your artboard. You come here and then pick a tool to help you do that. And at the top, you can see we have our menu bar. So on the menu bar, we have file, we have edit, we have image, we have layer, type, select, filter, view, plugins, window, and then help. So whilst we work, or as we go on, I'll be explaining what each and every one of these does and how to use them or how to work with them. On our right side, you can see other panels too. So at the top section, we have the color panel. So the color panel helps you select a color you want to use in your work. So we have this huge color box here. So this huge color box here gives us the brightness of the hue red. So this panel here, or this option here, basically shows you the hue of colors there are. So you have different hues here. You have blue, red, purple, green, yellow, red, orange. So all these are hues. And then on this rectangular box here, we have the saturation. So if we push this small circle all the way to the right, that means we have a fully saturated version of that color. And if we push it all the way to the left, that means we have a low saturated or desaturated version of the color. And also at the top, if we select the top, we have the brightest version of the color. And if we pull that circle all the way to the bottom, we have the darkest version of that color. Okay, let me explain it better so that you understand. Okay, so I'm going to my tools panel. So I'm going to click these two arrows here to expand the tools panel so you can see all the tools in there. So we have a tool here called the brush tool. So you know what a brush is. A brush is basically used for painting and painting on our canvas. So I'm going to go to the brush tool here. So I'll click on this brush tool. So I'm going to use this brush tool to paint certain colors, and while I was explaining what the color panel or what this rectangular color space helps you to do. Okay, so let me first reduce the size of my brush. So to reduce the size of your brush, you can go to the second panel here after the menu bar, the second bar here. You see this option, this round dot here, and this dot allows you to change the hardness or softness or the sizes of your brush. So I'll click this drop down here, and then here you can see that we have the size and then we have hardness. So I'm going to reduce the size of my brush first. Okay, so I think this size is okay. So this slider helps you change or adjust the size of your brush. And then the hardness. So what hardness basically means that if we have a 0% hardness, that means the edges of our brush is going to be soft. Let me demonstrate. So let me increase the size of my brush a bit. Then I'm going to choose any color at all. Let me go back to that drop down, and then we have our hardness set to 0%. So I'm just going to click once on my canvas. So with hardness at 0%, you realize that once I made a small dot on the canvas, it has this blur faded edge. I hope you guys can see it, and I hope you guys are following.
Yes, please.
Okay, so with hardness at 0, you have this blur or faded output on the edge of your brush. So let's see what happens when I change the hardness to 100%. And let's paint on a different area of our canvas. So you realize that with the hardness at 100%, the edges are more sharper than the previous one. So hardness 100% basically means that the brush is going to have a sharp edge. And then hardness at 0% means that you're going to have a faded edge on your brush. Do we understand to this point? Okay, let me continue. Okay, so as I've explained, we have 0% hardness, which makes the edges of your brush blurry or faded, and then 100% which makes the edge of your brush sharper or straight. Okay, so underneath that, you see some brush presets over here. So I think I mentioned presets in the creating of the document. Okay, so just like creating presets for your document, you can also have presets for your brush. So here we have default presets for our brushes in Photoshop. So first preset folder we have here is the general brushes. So here it has created default preset for you to choose from. So it has a soft round brush preset and a hard round brush preset. So instead of coming here to change the hardness and softness values, you can just come and click here on this soft round. It gives you the soft faded edge brush, and then if we choose a hard round, it gives you a brush with a straight edge or a sharp edge. And then if you want to undo whatever you have done on your canvas, you can just press Ctrl Z or Ctrl Z on your keyboard to undo whatever it is you've done. Okay, so let's go back to the color panel. Okay, so I'm going to reduce the size of my brush, and then, so like I said, from top to down determines the brightness of the color. I think this is the best way I can explain it. From top to down determines the brightness of that color, and from left to right determines the saturation of that color. If I paint, let me just make a dot here. Okay. Let me just type something here. Saturated plus brightest. Yes, so this is basically what I mean. So with a point or a round circle at the top right color, we are basically choosing the most saturated and the most brighted version of that color. But if we bring it down to the bottom left, the bottom right, we'll have the darkest and most saturated version of that color. And since it's the darkest, we are basically going to get black if we paint. So let me go back to my brush tool. And then if I paint black, you basically have black as my color. And the reason why you cannot see the color value or the value of that color is that we are at the lowest brightness of that color, which is basically black. But I don't want to talk too much about this. Let's focus on other things. Okay, so you've opened your Photoshop software, you have the interface, you've created a new document, and then you see all these panels. And anytime you buy a new tool or anytime you buy any equipment, what's the first thing you do is to place or set the equipment in a way that it's easy for you to use or it's easy for you to work with. So that's the same thing with Photoshop. So we have all our panels here, and one thing about Photoshop is there are most times that you don't really need all of them, all these panels on your interface or in your workspace. So what you can do is you can click and drag out those panels and then just close them by clicking this X icon. So you can just bring the panels that you do not need and just close them. So mostly I don't need these panels in my workspace, so I just close all of them. And then the properties panel. Properties panel is one of the most important panels in Photoshop. So you always have to make sure that you still have the properties panel inside of your workspace or your interface. But I don't want it to be at this right side. So what I can do is I can minimize it. And to minimize it, I'll just click and drag out this panel here. And then here you can see a minimized version of all these. So you have these panels here which have been minimized or consolidated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this properties panel. I'm going to click and drag it here into this section here. So you see that it has highlighted a little blue box. I'm going to click and drag it into that box, and then we have a minimized version of that panel. So when I click on that icon, it just brings the full window of that panel here. Okay, so let's click on it again to close it. I'll click and drag it out and then place it in this section. And now we are left with our layers, channels, and paths. So you can leave these panels here where they are because you are going to work a lot with the layers panel. So the layers panel is a panel that houses all the layers that you've created or you're going to work with. So this This panel helps you easily identify the layers you've created and also where each element you've imported into your document is placed. So let's say I try clicking and dragging a picture or something into Photoshop. So let me go to my folder and then bring this image into Photoshop. Okay, so I've imported that image into Photoshop and then I can scale it out to how I want it. So after scaling, you can just click on this check mark here to approve or to enter the image into your canvas. Or you can just press the enter key on your keyboard to place the image on your canvas. Okay, so I have this image here. You realize that as soon as I imported my image into Photoshop, Photoshop has created a new layer. So these boxes here you see are layers. So Photoshop created a new layer for this image. So let's say I bring in another image into my workspace. So you see that it has created another layer in our layers panel. So anytime you import an image or anytime you place a text into our document, Photoshop creates layers for each and every single one of those images or assets you've imported. So layers in Photoshop are basically transparent canvases placed on your document or placed on top of each other to create a composition. So all these here, let me create. So this option here, right, this icon you see here with the plus allows me to create a new transparent layer. So I'm going to create about 3 or 4 transparent layers and then use it to explain what layers are. Okay, so I have 4 transparent layers and then I'm going to paint on each and every one of these layers. So let's pick the first transparent layer I created, which is labeled layer 1. Then I'll go to my brush tool. Now I want to use a certain color to create, let's see, a design or a brush stroke on the canvas. But you realize that I have closed my colors panel. There is a different method of choosing a color. So here you see 2 boxes. There's one box on top of another. And the first one here is what we call the foreground color. And then the one underneath that square is what we call the background color. So any color that is placed on the foreground color is what will show when you try painting on your canvas. So here you realize that we have the black color as a foreground color. And when I paint, that's the color that shows. But if I click this option here to interchange those colors, so now we have red being our foreground color and we have black being our background color. And if I start painting, you realize that now we have a red brush stroke. That means now the color red is our foreground color and the color black is now our background color. So since we are going to be using our foreground color, we want to change that. We don't want red, we don't want black. So what we'll do is we'll double click on the square box, the foreground color option. We'll double click it and it will create this new window where we can select our color from. So yeah, I'm just going to pick any color at all. Let's go with purple and let me clear these strokes. Okay, so I have purple as my foreground color and I'm going to paint something on this layer right here, which is layer 1. So I'm just going to paint this stroke here on our layer 1. And then we'll click on our second layer, which is labeled layer 2. So I'll click on the layer 2 and then I'll go back to my foreground color option, double click on the square or the little box there, and then we'll choose a different color. So this time I'm going to go with the color green and then we'll paint. Make sure you have the second layer selected, which is labeled layer 2. And then we'll paint another stroke on top of it. And then we'll go to our third layer and then we'll do the same thing. We'll just go to our foreground color option, double click, choose a different color, click OK, and then make sure you have that layer selected. And then we'll paint over a bit of the green. And then we'll do the same for the fourth layer. Select it, come to our foreground color option, double click, select a color we want to use, we'll go with red, and then click OK. And then we'll paint on top of that blue stroke, that light blue stroke. Okay, so now I've painted on all these 4 layers, and then you realize that we have layer 2 on top of layer 1, layer 3 on top of layer 2, and layer 4 on top of layer 3. So now what happens when I change the arrangement of these layers? Let's say I bring the layer 4 to the bottom, or let's say below the layer 1. So if I click and drag the thumbnail below the layer 1, what happens is that now the layer 4 comes under all these 3 layers. So you realize that first we painted on top of this blue, but since we've dragged that layer, which is layer 4, beneath all our other layers, that color, which is the red, comes beneath all those layers. And let's see if the same thing happens if I move the layer 2 below all our layers. So if I click and drag, realize that now the color green or our layer 2 is now beneath these 3 layers. So this is basically the navigation of layers. So whatever layer is at the top is what shows at the top of our canvas, and what layer shows below all the other layers is what shows beneath the topmost layers. So let's rearrange all this again. Let's bring back our layer 1, then layer 3.